Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. Core is a lovely trope, by the way. In English, the word core, spelled C-O-R-P-S, refers to a body of people or a group who are committed to a common aim. Like the Peace Corps that was set up by Kennedy in the 60s. So now we're in the 21st century, and the Truth Core begins to emerge at the moment that members of all the races around the world face the greatest crime against humanity that has ever been attempted. It's just an attempted crime. It is not, mind you, an accomplished crime. The word core, spelled C-O-R-P-S, comes from the Latin corpus, meaning body, as in habeas corpus. So if you are in the truth core, you embody truth, and you stand with the body or group of those who do likewise. Now the trope plays to the second word, same sounding word, core, spelled C-O-R-E. So when you are in the truth core, you are also at the core of the great correction facing humanity as this heinous crime unfolds in the world drama, and more people all the time are seeing it for what it is and taking a stand to expose it, oppose it, and defeat it. Well, enough of the chitter-chatter. Now we come to the title, the topic and title of this talk, which is Two Myths of Human Design. Note carefully the syntax. I could have said two myths of human creation. But I'm not using the word creation because in the critical syntax of comparative mythology, there are special cases and special applications for that word. And as well, I have another intention. Human design, well, what does it suggest to you? There must be a designer. The great designer. How many people would say God is the great designer? Then, predictably, they would go on and give you some really lame-ass received notion of who God is. The nifty thing about this trope, human design, is that it brings to the forefront of your mind the very real fact that the human animal is designed. You have been designed. So the question is, who designed you? And these two myths both explicitly describe who designed the human species generically as a species. As I noted in the first talk, at the risk of cutting a new groove in your NLP, that the great vast majority of creation myths are race-specific in authorship, but also race-specific in the narrative of creation, the origin story. But there are two exceptions coming right around the bend. So, once again, I invite you into the studio of the comparative mythologist. Here we are, standing side by side, don't I wish? And we're looking at the great table. There are 40 files in the front part of the table. At the top of these 40, there are two separate files. And also on the table is the complete 13-volume set of the mythology of all races. What I do now is I collect those 40 dossiers. and I stacked them in a pile. And I pushed them over to one corner of the table, say over to the left. And then I reach forward and I draw down the 2 remaining files so that they're right in front of us. We look down at them together. And I'm going to leave the set of reference books on the table because, in fact, I'm actually going to use that set as we proceed. Remember that the 48 files that I've set aside all have a label or a title, and those titles are racial. Japanese, Persian, Chinese, Incan, they all refer to particular races who live in particular places and speak particular languages. As a matter of fact, let me just take a moment to introduce you to a handy little tool of comparative mythology. You know that DNA is a common term now, common acronym. And it's fair to say that just about everyone who has a little bit of mind left that works knows what DNA is. Everyone knows that DNA is a way to identify a person. So DNA is the material of identity. Well, when you look at a race, there is a DNA formula for a race as well. And that formula is RPL. So you can consider investigating the RPL of a race or ethnic group just as you can investigate the DNA of an individual. So RPL stands for race, place, and language. So that formula incorporates DNA in the first letter, race. A race is identified by its DNA, but it adds 2 other factors, place and language. So every race that has formed a culture, a community, or a nation that has ever existed in history and exists today has the identity of RPL, race, place, and language. So the titles on these 40 folders refer to one or other of those elements, but generally they refer to the name of a particular racial group, such as Melanesian peoples or Scandinavian peoples. And as you can see, these designations are quite broad. Within the Scandinavian peoples, we would then look at the particular breakdown of that racial group into Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, and so forth. So here we are standing over those 2 dossiers and looking down to see the label on each one of them. And as we do that, or before we do that, I invite you to consider a question. Is it possible to go to the Mythology of All Races, which is a standard reference set, and to find in the table of contents of these volumes the names that will appear on these 2 dossiers? Well, let's give it a run just to see. Here are the titles of the 12 volumes of the Mythology of All Races. 1. Greek and Roman. 2. Eddic, Eddic. 3. Celtic and Slavic. 4. Finno-Ugric and Siberian. 5. Semitic. 6. Indian and Iranian. Of course, Indian means Hindu, Indian of the Indian subcontinent. 7. Armenian and African. 8. Chinese and Japanese. 9. Oceanic. 10. North American. 11. Latin American. And 12. Egyptian and Indo-Chinese. So, does it happen that any one of those titles of those volumes matches one of the names of the two files on the table, the two unopened files? Well, as a matter of fact, it does, because volume 5 is titled Semitic, and that is the title on one of these files. So, Semitic mythology contains an example of a creation myth that describes the design and origin of the human species, the design of the human genome. Everything is material. When you talk about human design, when you use that trope, it points you to the realization that the human species of which you are a member is the expression of a design, and that design is material. It's carried in the genome, and the genome is substantial. The genome is a complex molecular unit of nucleic acid. You can consider the nucleic acid to be like a gel that contains the double helix, which is the material design of the human genome. And of course, it's the same for other species. It would be lions, cats, elephants, whales, butterflies, eagles, whatever. They all have their genomic design. Well, this is a fortunate moment. We have a dossier in front of us labeled Semitic, and there's a volume in the reference series called Semitic. So keep your eye on me now. Watch me closely. I'm going to reach out and I'm going to open up that volume to the index page. I'm just going to scan what's in there. It's reasonable to assume, so far in the investigation, that the documents and the evidence that is in the file labeled Semitic could also be found in this volume. So what does the table of contents say? There are 12 chapters, and they go like this. 1. Geographical and linguistic distribution of Semitic races and deities. 2. The Sumero-Akkadian pantheon. 3. The legend of Etana and the plant of birth. 4. The myth of Adapa and Adam. 5. The Sumerian legends of Tagtug and paradise. 6. Legends of the deluge. 7. The epic of Gilgamesh. 8. Legends of the destruction of men, or the poem of Ea and Atahasis. 9. The Babylonian epic of creation and similar Semitic myths. 10. The descent of Ishtar and Aralu. 11. Tammuz and Ishtar. 12. The devils, demons, good and evil spirits. Now there's some rich material that could occupy you during lockdown. Of course, we're not in lockdown. The world is not in lockdown. That's a lie. Some places are. And the mainstream media is making a really big point of pushing the narrative about those places. But not every place in the world is under lockdown. And even in those places where the authorities are staging a dramatic event of terror, even in those places, the lockdown is merely a charade. So let's play along with the con. Let's suppose that you and I are in a lockdown, and we're going to dedicate 4 hours a day for 5 days to investigate how, if and how, the contents of this volume correspond to the contents of the file labeled semitic. Fast forward to the conclusion of our study. The conclusion is somewhat startling and, dare I say, intriguing. Because what we find when we open this dossier labeled Semitic is a profile of a mythology that doesn't exactly fit with any of the information in Volume 5. There are some elements, certainly, some motifs, some characters, some themes, some illusions, some clues in that volume that match what's in the dossier. But the odd thing is that the Mythology of All Races volume dedicated to that title doesn't really describe the unique and anomalous features of the Semitic myth of human design. Why not? Well, it has to do, in fact, with the mindset of those who wrote that volume between 1916 and 1932. And I have to hand it to them that they were serious scholars who held their standard. And at that time, they did not deem it appropriate to put a chapter in their book titled The Hebrew or Biblical Myth of Creation, which is a Semitic myth. So why didn't they dedicate at least one chapter to the biblical myth of creation, which is the most well-known and pervasive myth or narrative in the entire world? That's because they were doing their job correctly. And they knew that the mythical narrative in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, and so forth, is actually a mélange. It's a pastiche of other myths, diverse myths, that have been derived from various Semitic cultures, such as the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians. And they knew that, from their point of view anyway, they presumed that there was nothing special or unique about the biblical creation myth of the ancient Hebrews. And they were wrong about that. But they did not have the Gnostic tools of discernment and the forensic skills and tools that come with Gnosis that would have enabled them to see how the biblical creation myth is anomalous. It is not simply a montage of borrowed and hijacked materials from other mythologies. It is largely that, but at the same time, it contains some really significant and exceptional elements. And in their time and setting, which was before the Nag Hammadi writings were discovered in 1945 and published in English in 1976, they didn't have the advantage to make a more critical analysis of biblical myth, and so they just threw it in the stew with the other Semitic myths and narratives, and they didn't take note that there's something weird about it. Now let's turn to the other file. What's the label on the other file? Well, there are actually 3 labels on the other file. The top label is a label that refers to the race-specific authorship of this other mythic narrative. And that label is Aryan, or Aryan Caucasian. And under that label, in brackets, is the word Persian. So, obviously, Aryan Caucasian refers to a vast racial branch of the human species. Persian refers to a thread or strand in that branch, and it was through the Persian peoples and their culture that this other myth came to expression, came to be written, and made available to the world. Additional to these labels, there are two others, Gnostic and Sofianic. They do not refer necessarily to races. The term Gnostic refers to the specialist storytellers who took it as their mission to develop and preserve this narrative of human design. And the term Sofianic refers to the central figure in the narrative, the wisdom goddess Sophia. So there you have it. Our investigation so far reveals that there are two mythic narratives which are unique in the way that they describe the origin of the human species or human design. And they both describe the origination of the design, how it was accomplished, and for what purpose. But they do so in quite different ways. So I spoke at the beginning of this series, and this is a series, by the way. These talks ought to be followed in sequence. So I'm indicating M1, M2, M3. M, you could say, stands for Mythology 101. So in listening to these talks, you are attending a course in Mythology 101, and this is the second in the series. I said at the beginning of the series that I had made a discovery. I made many discoveries in my lifetime of studying mythology, but my greatest discovery was the fact, the provable fact, that there are only two myths that describe the origin of the human species generically. So although these two myths are also race-specific in authorship, one being authored by a Semitic race or a strain of the Semitic races, and the other being authored by a strain of the Aryan, Caucasian, white races. I do wonder by now if you have taken the full impact of that statement on board. What you're looking at is two myths, two narratives. And upon these two narratives, the fate of humanity rides. And it's a turbulent ride. The ride is getting to be really, really turbulent. And why is that so? As I intend to explain, these two myths are adversarial. They are actually at war with each other. These two mythic narratives stand in a battle situation. And the war, or the cause of the war, is to determine what truly is human identity and human purpose on this planet. This Semitic myth has one version, it has one program or agenda for human identity and human purpose. And the Sofianic myth has another one. And these two myths are in conflict with each other. They are in a duel to the death. What's happening in the world right now with the Great Reset? Well, the battle between these two myths is coming to a climax. And you are in it. And you are in it whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not. So it would benefit you greatly to know what side you're on, to know which narrative you follow, so that you can find your way through this battle and survive. As I said, the discovery of these two myths was my greatest discovery in comparative mythology. And it now brings me and you, if you choose to come along, to the greatest challenge that has ever faced humanity. One hears the reference quite often in the alternative media mainly, the battle for the narrative. That's what we're in. We're in a battle for the narrative. And one or the other of these two narratives wins the battle. It's as simple as that. I'll leave it there for the moment. In the next talk, we'll stand together and we'll open up these two files and we'll look at the contents and compare the fundamental elements of the creation story presented in each one of them. Semitic versus sofianic. They both identify the great designer, the creator God. They both identify how creation was accomplished, and they both identify the purpose of creation. So that is, in all, the great perspective, or the contrast of two perspectives that I will undertake in the next talk. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.